Welcome to this another lecture on Introduction to Literary Theory. And in the previous lecture, we have looked at the contributions of Plato, and in this particular lecture, we will be looking at the contributions of one of the greatest philosophers of the world, that's Aristotle. He was also the student of Plato, and therefore you would see a lot of similarities and also a lot of differences between them. If you look let's begin by looking at the life of Aristotle. Aristotle was born in 384 and lived till 322 BC. He was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist. He founded his own school and he named it Lyceum, and he spent most of his time teaching in his school Lyceum. Some of his most notable works include Nicomachean Ethics, Politics, Metaphysics, Poetics, which is extremely important, especially for our study today, and Prior Analytics. When we begin to look at some of the ideas of Aristotle, let's begin looking at the subject of inquiry of poetry. So he says the subject of inquiry of poetry should be construction of plots, or how a storyline is constructed, how a story is built. That should be the inquiry of poetry. Now I'm constantly using the word poetry in reference to every material that is produced. That's because the meaning of the word poetry was different for Aristotle, Plato, and the ancient Greeks. It referred to any kind of material or text that was produced, be it epic, be it play, or a poem. Unlike today, when we use the word poetry only to refer to poems. One of the great ideas of Aristotle was differentiating, how art is differentiated. So he says all representations differ in three ways. The first one is media, objects, and manner. So let's look at each of them separately and try and understand them. So the first one is media. Now every art or every representation, whether it is dancing, whether it is singing, painting, drawing, or writing poetry, all of them have their own tools. Every art has its own tools, and some arts use color and forms, and some arts use images, sound, rhythm, speech, and melody. So different arts use different media, and that media where words are used to represent, we give it a name saying poetry, or the person who constructs poetry or represents things by use of words, we give him a name poet. And that's indiscriminately used, because you cannot discriminate something that is poetically represented in the field of science as non-poetic, because that also comes into the ambit of poetry. So therefore a science book with verse, you still call the creator of that particular work as a poet. So therefore literature is such a vast area, or a broad area, that it has the ability, the capability to take everything and everybody, all inclusive. So that is to do with the media. The second one is the object. What do you represent, or whom do you represent? So the characters represented are either good or inferior. It can be the characters could be too good, or they could be inferior. Now these characters differ from vice and virtue. So you have two different kinds of characters. One set of characters are very good, the other set of characters are not very good. So characters could be of three categories. They could be better than we are, worse than we are, or such as we are. So when you take a particular play and begin to analyze the characters of that play, you would get to know there are characters which are much better than us. That is the first category of characters. The second category of characters, we would have characters which are very bad. with filled with all vices. This is the second kind of characters. And the third one, just like us, with whom we associate a lot. So therefore these are the kind of characters, these objects are represented. Comedy represents people worse than we are, and tragedy people better than we are. That's simply because if we take up tragedy, you would know, especially when we take up the four great tragedies of William Shakespeare, we would get to know all the tragic heroes always belonged to the aristocratic class. The heroes did not come from the ordinary class, and therefore tragedy represents people better than we are, because those people represented in tragedy belong to the aristocratic class and not to the ordinary common people. Comedy represents people worse than we are, because you look at those people who sort of are involved in creating laughter. Those are the clowns. And nobody wants to be a clown. Everybody wants to belong to that aristocratic class, which is what is represented by tragedy. And finally, we will look at what is manners. Now, manners is nothing but, in simple words, narration or narrators, or the style of narrating. So therefore we could have three types of narration. The first one is becoming another person, that is the narrating something in third person. For example, I could also be part of the story, but I narrate it in the perspective of somebody else. So that's third person narration. Normally this is something that's prominently used by many people. Third person narration, he goes there, she goes there, or narrating a story of my friend with his perspective. So that's third person narration. The second type of narration could be remaining same person and not changing. That is first person narration, where I become an integral part of the story and I narrate it in such a manner that I know everything that happens in the life of every other character. So therefore I am very integral part of that story. So that is second type, and that's basically done in first person. And the final one, the last one, by representing everyone as in action and activity. So you have here as though it's also called omnipotent narrator. There is a narrator who is sort of above everybody else, and you have all the characters performing right in front of him. So therefore he has knowledge of everybody else. He is not part of the story, but he is sort of looking at everybody and then narrating a story. So there are these are the three things that we have to discuss about Aristotle when it comes to the differences in representation in art. So first you have the media, the tools that are used, different tools that are used by different arts, and the object, and basically in poetry we refer to the representation of characters, which are sometimes good, sometimes bad, or as we are. And finally the manners. Manners is especially reference to the kind of narration that can be used. You can narrate a story in third person, you can narrate a story in first person, or you can also have an omnipotent narrator who looks at the world from outside. He is not part of the story and objectively narrates it. So this is all that I have to speak to you all in this particular video, but we will look at some more ideas of Aristotle in the next video. Thank you for listening, and see you all in the next class.